Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava, page 54b on the top of the page. The Gemara asks, but can it be inferred that if an ox that is of standard intelligence fell into a pit, the owner of the pit would be exempt? Rabbi Yirmiyah said the Mishnah is speaking, utilizing the style of, it is not necessary, and it should be as understood as follows. It is not necessary to state that if an ox is of standard intelligence fell into a pit, that the pit's owner is liable. But with regard to an ox that is deaf, an imbecile, or very young, say that it was not due to the pit alone that it fell in, but its deafness caused it to fall in, or its young age caused it to fall in, and the owner of the pit should be exempt. Therefore, it teaches us that he is liable in these cases as well. Rav Acha said to Ravina, but isn't it taught in a Braita, if a living being that is mentally competent fell into a pit, the owner is exempt? What? Is it not referring to an ox that is mentally competent? Ravina said to him, no, it is referring to a person. Rav Acha challenges this response. If that is so, you should then infer that it is only for the injuries of a person who is mentally competent that he is exempt. But if one is not mentally competent, is the halacha that he would be liable? But the term an ox is written in the Torah as causing liability and not a person. Rava responded to Rav Acha, rather, what does the term mentally competent mean? It is referring to a species that is mentally competent and thereby includes all humans in the exemption from liability. Rav Acha said to him, but isn't it taught in a Braita, if an ox that was mentally competent fell inside, he is exempt? Rather, Rava said that Rabbi Yirmiyah's explanation should be rejected, and the Mishnah is referring specifically to an ox that is deaf, an ox that is an imbecile, and an ox that is very young, for which he is liable, but for an ox that is of standard intelligence, he is exempt. What is the reason? The reason is that the ox should have looked carefully while walking. If it did not, it is responsible for its own injury. The Gemara notes that idea is also taught in a Braita. With regard to an ox that is deaf, an imbecile, or very young, blind, or that is walking at night or unable to see, if it fell into a pit, the pit's owner is liable. But if the ox is of standard intelligence, or is walking during the day, the pit's owner is exempt, since normal behavior for oxen is that, ordinarily, they watch where they are going to and avoid pits. New Mishnah. The halacha is the same whether concerning an ox or whether concerning any other animal with regard to liability for falling into a pit, and with regard to keeping its distance from Mount Sinai at the time of receiving the Torah, when it was forbidden for any animal to ascend the mountain, and with regard to the payment of double the principal by a thief, and with regard to the mitzvah of returning a lost item, and with regard to unloading its burden, and with regard to the prohibition of muzzling it while threshing, and with regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds, and with regard to the prohibition against its working on Shabbat. And similarly, undomesticated animals and birds are subject to the same halachot as domesticated animals. If so, why are all of the above halachot stated in the Torah only in reference to an ox or a donkey? Rather, the reason is that the verse speaks of a common scenario from which the other cases may be derived. Gemara. The Gemara explains the sources for all the halachot enumerated in the Mishnah that apply to all animals. With regard to falling into a pit, it is written, he shall recompense money to its owners. Kesef Yashiv L'Ba'ala of Exodus 21:34, which means that any animal that has owners is included, as we mentioned, see 54a, with regard to the requirement that animals keep their distance from Mount Sinai before giving of the Torah. This is derived from the verse, whether it be an animal or a person, it shall not live, Exodus 19:13. And an undomesticated animal, a chaya, is also included in the term animal, in Behemah. In addition, the word whether serves to include birds. With regard to the double payment of a thief, it is, as we say, in a halachic exegesis of the verse, for any matter of trespass, Exodus 22:8. That is a general statement which includes any manner of negligence with regard to the mitzvah of returning a lost item. The verse states comprehensively, for every lost thing of your brother, Deuteronomy 22:3, with regard to the halacha of unloading a burden, derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbat, as the word donkey is employed in the context of unloading a burden. See Exodus 23, verse 5. And the word donkey is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbat. See Deuteronomy 5:14, and that verse is clearly referring to any animal. With regard to the prohibition against muzzling an animal mentioned in the verse, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is threshing, Deuteronomy 25:4. Derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbat, as the word ox is employed in the context of muzzling, and the word ox is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbat. See Deuteronomy 5:14. And that verse is clearly referring to any animal. With regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds, it is referring to the prohibition against using diverse kinds for plowing, due to which it is forbidden to plow with an ox and a donkey together. See Deuteronomy 22:10. Derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbat, as the word ox is employed in the context of plowing with diverse kinds, and the word ox is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbat. See Deuteronomy 5:14, and that verse is clearly referring to any animal. If it is referring to the prohibition of diverse kinds for crossbreeding, derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbat, as the term your cattle is employed in the context of crossbreeding animals. See Leviticus 19:19. And the term your cattle is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbat. See Exodus 20:10. And that verse is clearly referring to any animal. The Gemara asks, and from where do we derive concerning Shabbat itself that the words ox and donkey are referring to all types of animals? As it is taught in a Braita, Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, in the first version of the Ten Commandments it is stated, your manservant, your maidservant, nor your cattle. Exodus 20:10, whereas in the second version of the Ten Commandments it is stated, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle. Deuteronomy 5:14. Now aren't an ox and a donkey already included in the category of all animals, which are included in the term cattle? Why then were they specified? To teach you that just as with regard to the terms ox and donkey that are stated here, undomesticated animals and birds have the same halakha as them, so too everywhere that an ox and donkey are mentioned, all types of undomesticated animals and birds have the same halacha as them. The Gemara asks, but why not say that the verses be expounded as follows? The term cattle used in the first version of the Ten Commandments is a generalization, and the phrase your ox and your donkey used in the latter version of the Ten Commandments is a detail. In the case of a generalization and a detail, the principles of halakhic exegesis dictate that the generalization includes only what is specified in the detail. Therefore, with regard to this subject, an ox and a donkey should indeed be included, but anything else should not be included. The sages said in reply, in the phrase, nor any of your cattle stated in the latter version of the Ten Commandments, following the phrase, your ox and your donkey, it then generalized again. Therefore, the verse is structured as a generalization and a detail and a generalization. According to the principles of halakhic exegesis, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. Consequently, just as the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as animals, so too, all items included in the general term must be animals. The Gemara challenges the answer, but say instead that just as all the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as an item, that is, an animal whose carcass renders a person ritually impure through contact, through carrying, so too all items whose carcass renders a person ritually impure through contact or through carrying should be included. But birds whose carcasses do not render one impure through contact or through carrying should not be included. The sages said in reply, if so, let the merciful one write only one detail from which this could be derived. The Gemara asks, which detail should the merciful one write? If the merciful one writes only an ox, I would say an animal that is sacrificed on the altar, such as an ox, indeed renders the owner of the pit liable, whereas an animal that is not sacrificed on the altar does not render him liable. And the merciful one writes only a donkey, I would say an animal whose firstborn is sanctified, such as a donkey as described in the Torah, Exodus 13:13, does indeed render him liable. But an animal whose firstborn is not sacrificed does not render him liable. Therefore, the merciful one writes both an ox and a donkey. Consequently, there is no redundancy, and each detail is required for correctly deriving other halachot. If so, the previous question resurfaces. Why are the verses not expounded such that the prohibition does not include birds? Rather, the term, nor any of your cattle should be understood, as an amplification encompassing any item that is even partially similar to the detail. The Gemara asks, but is this the case, that anywhere that the merciful one writes states the word any, kol, is intended as an amplification, but concerning ties where it is written kol, and yet we expound the verses with the method of a generalization and a detail, rather than using the method of amplification and restriction, as it is taught in a Braita concerning second tithe money brought to Jerusalem. The verse states, and you shall give the money for anything, but kol asher tishalcha nafshecha, for anything your soul desires. Deuteronomy 14:26, which is a generalization, followed by for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, which is a detail, and it concludes with, or for anything your soul asks of you, where it is generalized again, klal uprat uklal. Iatadad elkeina prat. Ma prat miforash pri vigdule karka. Avkol pri vigdule karka. Therefore, the verse is structured as a generalization and a detail and a generalization according to the principles of halakhic exegesis. You may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. Consequently, just as the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as produce of produce, that is, they grow from a parent organism, such as agricultural produce or animals, and they are grown from the ground, that is, their sustenance comes from the ground, so too it includes all things that are from the produce of produce and are grown from the ground. It is evident from here that the method of a generalization and the detail is used in connection with the term kol, as opposed to interpreting it as an amplification. Okay, 1 more minute left. The sages said in response, a distinction may be drawn between the term for anything, bechol, which is a generalization, and the term any, kol, as in any of your cattle, which is an amplification. And if you wish, say instead that the word any, kol, is a generalization as well, in addition to for anything, bechol, bakol. But this word any written here as an amplification, this is the case, since it could have been written and your cattle. And it is written in the first version of the Ten Commandments, and instead it writes, nor any of your cattle. Learn from this that it is an amplification and encompasses other animals as well. I think we'll stop here for time.